sitting at the back look terribly comfortable, but there are seats at the front if you would like to move forward at this point. No, they're going to stay where they are. It's a pleasure today to introduce today's talk and speaker. Iain Wilson is originally from Liverpool, but for the last 10 years he's lived near Thornhill in Dumfries and Galloway. In the Tracks of Mortality, which came out as a paperback in 2016, his book on Robert Paterson, the restorer of Covenanting graves and supposed provider of anecdotes for Scott's Tales of Mortality, stemmed from his interest in the local history of the region and its countryside, which he has walked extensively. Iain works as a project manager for a charity in Dumfries. He's a historian by qualification, and this was his second book on a subject relatively neglected in modern times, which we look forward to hearing much more about this evening. Iain.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. I do feel quite daunted talking about this subject in front of such august company, but let's see what happens. Now, if you're at all familiar with the southwest of Scotland, especially Galloway, you'll know that it's difficult to go very far without tripping over a gravestone or a monument or some reference to the Covenanters. And they were, in the modern context, hardline Presbyterians who fought against the crown in defence of their faith during the 17th century, with often tragic consequences. And if you try to find out a little more about the Covenanters, you quickly stumble across this chap, who by popular account was responsible for carving and repairing many of their gravestones, and who was himself supposed to be a dyed-in-the-wool Covenanter, or at least a fellow traveller. Now, the problem I found when I started to look into his background was that there was little concrete information, and what there was inconsistent, and in some cases plainly wrong. So through my own research, what I've tried to do in my book is to present a more rounded picture of the man and his family, and also of the times in which he lived. But before we start to talk about Robert Paterson, we have to talk about Walter Scott, obviously, because we wouldn't be talking about Paterson at all if Scott hadn't created the character of Old Mortality based upon Paterson and written a novel of the same title. In the opening chapter of the novel, Scott described the meeting he claimed to have had with Old Mortality in the churchyard of Dunnottar on the northeast coast of Scotland, as you can see here. I say claimed because it's evident that Scott used some artistic license for this encounter, which I'll come back to later. Scott, nonetheless, in the novel, painted the picture of a tranquil summer evening, where amongst the gentle chiding of the brook and the sighing of the wind in the boughs, his peace was disturbed by the occasional clink of a hammer in the distance. Upon closer inspection, he came across an old man, seated upon the monument of the slaughtered Presbyterians, and busily employed in deepening with his chisel the letters of the inscription. The old man's appearance was unusual, he thought. A blue bonnet of unusual dimensions covered the grey hairs of the pious workman. His dress was a large, old-fashioned coat of the coarse cloth called hodden grey, usually worn by the elder peasants, with waistcoat and breeches of the same. And the whole suit, though still in decent repair, had obviously seen a train of long service. Strong clouted shoes studded with hobnails, and gramoche or leggings made of thick black cloth completed his equipment. And he wasn't alone. Beside him fed among the braves a pony, the companion of his journey, whose extreme whiteness, as well as its projecting bones and hollow eyes, indicated its antiquity. Scott goes on to say that he invited Old Mortality back to the local tavern for a drink, and spent the evening teasing out of the old man stories about the Covenanting period. And he used this as a way of introducing the rest of the novel, which, despite the title, is not about Old Mortality, but is in fact the story of star-crossed lovers on opposing sides of the conflict between the Covenanters and the state during the 1670s and 1680s. Nor does the book talk about Robert Paterson, Scott provided less than a paragraph of mostly wrong information about him in the original edition. But the character of the archaic, rather grumpy old man, as Scott portrayed him, caught the popular imagination enough at the beginning of the 19th century to encourage the novelist to delve more deeply into his real life story for the introduction to the 1830 edition, leaving to posterity a formal record of a man whom history might otherwise have neglected. As with most of Scott's work around this time, The Tale of All Mortality, to give the novel its full title, was similarly a huge commercial success. It was first printed in December 1816 under a pseudonym because of the contractual issues he had with his publisher, and went through 3 editions before his death in 1832. It remains obviously in print to this day. But the character of Old Mortality, as with many of Scott's portrayals, was no less popular, especially in Galloway, where people seized on the fact that Robert Paterson, a local man, had been the prototype. In 1838, a stone statue of Old Mortality and his pony was commissioned by the residents of Balmaclellan, where he and his family were based towards the end of his life. And this was thought to be so attractive that it was taken on a tour of the cities of Northern England, plus Glasgow and Edinburgh, before returning to the village where it still stands. And you can see here on the top left, the picture, the statue, the condition it was in, around about the end of the 1990s. And then as part of the millennial celebrations, the local community got the money together to be able to repair it, and it now stands in front of the church in much better condition. But the sculptor John Curry took the opportunity of the great popularity of Old Mortality to carve and sell, or raffle at least, 2 other copies of the statue. And these stand, or rather lie, in front of Dumfries and Newton Stewart museums respectively. And there's even a statue of Scott, together with the character he created, in Laurel Hill Cemetery in Pennsylvania in the USA. That's the one on the bottom left there. And this was carved by James Thom, originally from Ayrshire, who actually made his name from carving characters from Burns' poems, which you can still see in his birthplace in Alloway. So this is the context for the story of the man we're going to talk about now. But where did the story come from? I've already said that the original novel contained next to no information about the real-life character on which Old Mortality was based. However, I also mentioned that Scott included more information in a special introduction that he wrote for the 1830 edition. And for this, he relied largely on just one source of information, Joseph Train. Much like one of his other heroes, Robert Burns, Train came from Ayrshire. He served for a time in the local militia, and then he also had a career in the Customs and Excise in Dumfries and Galloway. And this plaque is in the town hall at Newton Stewart, where he lived for a while. There's a similar one in Castle Douglas, where he retired and where he's buried. Train was also a poet, although a minor one, and this is how he and Scott first met. And it was at their first meeting in 1816 that Train is supposed to have inspired Scott to use the character of Old Mortality to introduce the novel that he was already writing. And over the next 14 years, Train went on to furnish Scott with local tales, traditions, and not a few artefacts which found their way into many of Scott's later novels. And they made for quite an eclectic collection, including, for example, a drinking cup which Train said he was informed on good authority had been used by the lepers of King's Carse, a leprosy colony founded by Robert the Bruce, and the antique purse, which is to say the sporran, that once belonged to the celebrated freebooter Rob Roy. And he also unearthed this object, which he described as a cabinet of oak, which Gordon of Earlston carved away at and worked into wondrous forms during an imprisonment in Blackness Castle. Now, as you can well imagine, this wasn't posted to Scott, and actually it was retained by Train and is still in Train's family. It still belongs to a branch of the Train family. And it is like something out of the Antiques Roadshow. So Train, as I think you'll soon realise from the way he presents the story of Robert Paterson, found it difficult to divorce myth from reality, and was reluctant to stop to check the facts of a good story once he had uncovered it and got into his stride. Scott nonetheless included Train's version of the story, almost word for word, in his introduction to the 1830 edition of the novel. And if you look at the manuscript in the National Library here, you'll see that he literally cut it out of one of Train's letters and pasted it into a copy of the 1822 edition. And it's this version of the story which, with some additions and revisions by later historians, forms the basis of most people's understanding of Paterson's life today. So it's important that we set that version against other sources of information, not least Train's original source, which was Paterson's son, Robert Jr., who was still living in Balmaclellan, married and working as a shoemaker, when Train got him to write down his father's life story in 1827. Robert Paterson is most associated with Dumfries and Galloway, but he was actually born and brought up in Hawick in the Scottish borders. When he was born, however, is another matter. Robert Jr. says his parents were Walter Paterson and Margaret Scott, and sure enough, a son named Robert was born to them in April 1716, as you can see here. It appears, however, that his parents had an earlier child, also called Robert, in 1713. And this child appears to have died in childbirth or infancy, a very common occurrence at the time. We're talking about just 8 or 9 years after the union with England, when Scotland was very much the poor relation. The same family seems to have had two Johns and two Walters for the same reason. And they had another boy, Francis, 10 years older than our Robert, who we know survived and who had a successful career as a stonemason. This confusion is part of the reason why you'll see so many different dates for Paterson's birth around the region. The statue of Paterson outside Newton Stewart Museum, for example, has the birth year 1713. The family grave in Balmaclellan has him dying in 1800, aged 88, which suggests he was born in 1712, for which there's no evidence, but which didn't prevent the Hawick Archaeological Society from putting it on the stone they had carved in 1897 to mark Paterson's birthplace, as we can see here. And just for good measure, Joseph Train fudged the issue completely by saying he was born in 1715. So you pay your money and you take your choice. But for what it's worth, I would go with 1716. Now, the cottage in which Paterson was born was called Burnflat and stood in a small community called Hagisha, or some people would say Hagisha, about a mile to the south of Hawick itself. Here we see the cottage as it looked in the early years of the 20th century, with the then tenant standing outside. And you can see the stone plat which had already been erected by this stage, just to the right there. And here's the same site from the reverse angle in what I think is the early 1990s, after a series of fires that destroyed the property, which was by then only being used for stabling. And that's Hawick Golf Course in the background for those who know the area. And this is the site today. The house is long gone, marking the entrance to a new housing estate called, rather pleasingly, Paterson's Gardens. Now, Paterson lived here for the first 13 years of his life, and the local parish records are extensive enough to give us a fair picture of what life must have been like for him and of the major influences on him. And these included poverty, of course, even though his parents were minor landowners. His parents themselves, who would have ensured that he had a good education, was literate, understood the value of hard work and was church-going, although they were by no means fanatical in their beliefs. His schooling, one of his teachers, John Purdom, was old enough to have been involved in the Templar Rising, one of the Covenanter skirmishes of the 1670s, although he was on the opposite side. And the church, in which Paterson and his parents would have spent a good proportion of their Sundays, and where Paterson himself went to school, in the building that preceded this one. Excuse me. And where he would have played round the gravestones. And the ministers of Hawick during Paterson's time there also appear to have been on the moderate wing of the church. But Paterson, as we'll see, was long-lived, so these influences came to matter more in his later life. Note, however, that there's no evidence at this stage of any strong Covenanting influences on him. Now, at the age of 13, Paterson was apprenticed as a stonemason, as his brother Francis had already been. And one summer's day in 1729, he would have travelled with him on foot from Hawick to his new place of employment, which was Corncockle Quarry, between Lockerbie and Lochmaben. And one of the reasons for the existence of the quarries at Corncockle was the development of Spedlands Tower, which you can see here, which in the early 1600s was owned by the Johnston family. and the tower house, which still stands, would have been within just a few hundred yards of Paterson's place of work. By 1729, however, when Paterson and his brother worked here, the land was owned by the Jardine family, and they had begun to build a new house, Jardine Hall, just across the river from the quarries in 1710. So the top towards the middle there, this is a map of 1755 showing the outlines of the hall as it was then. The hall is long gone, it was destroyed after the Second World War. But the building of this hall would have kept Paterson and his colleagues employed at that time. And this is a painting of Corncockle Quarry from later in the 19th century, when it was most noted for the dinosaur footprints that were actually found in the local stone in 1813. And the quarry is still in occasional use today. The tools and techniques that Paterson would have learned to use during his apprenticeship and later career are covered in my book, but suffice to say here that he would have been taught to be a rough mason, that's to say one who extracts the stone from the quarry and roughly shapes it, and a freemason, or one who sculpts it into intricate shapes and carves detail or lettering into it. Or more generally in the 18th century, a stone cutter, as he was known. And during Paterson's time, any stone that could be easily carved for building and decorative purposes was known as a freestone, which in the case of much of southwest Scotland was sandstone, and therefore red, pink or even white freestone, depending on the local shading. You see examples of it here. These are all from Dumfries and Galloway. And you can see here the principal areas of the region in which sandstone can be found. And I put this up because to a very great extent these areas dictate the key events of Paterson's life and career. So for example, he was apprenticed at Corncockle, which is over here, and he later had his own quarry, which is in the Thornhill basin over here. He inevitably used stone from the Locker Briggs, which is down by Dumfries down there. And then while he was travelling, he would have used stone from local deposits all around the region, and also from across the water in Cumbria. And spoiler alert here, but when he died, which he did in the bank end of Laverock, there happened to be a small quarry there as well. So you can see that Paterson fits in every way into a local tradition of stonemasonry, using one of the region's rich natural resources. And by about 1739 or 1740, according to his son, he would have been ready to set out on his own. And now the story shifts to Nithsdale. Robert Jr. says that his mother was Elizabeth Gray, and she was the daughter of one Robert Gray, the gardener at Jardine Hall. Now, gardener in those days could have meant anything. Could have been a tenant, but it could have been a gardener as well. So the assumption in that is that she and Robert Sr. met as a result of her growing up and his working on the estate next to Corncockle. But by 1740, a year still memorable for Frost, her son says, Elizabeth was working as a kitchen maid in Closeburn House, the recently built home of the Kirkpatricks, just south of Thornhill. And for this she would have earned about 14 shillings a year, plus shoes and an apron. The Kirkpatricks went back to Norman times in the area, and of course are most famous in Scottish history as being at the side of Robert the Bruce when he slew the Red Comyn in Dumfries. By the 1740s, the then incumbent, a baronet named Thomas Kirkpatrick, was married to Susan Grierson of Cape Knock, and between them they owned most of Mid Nithsdale. And you can see here Closeburn Tower. Sorry, I beg your pardon. You can see here Closeburn Tower, the ancestral home to which the family returned in 1748 when Closeburn House itself, where Elizabeth Gray was working, burnt down. And today, although the house itself is just a ruin, as you can see there, a branch of the family still lives in the tower house, and the family actually comes from Spain, and their first language is Spanish, but their surname is Kirkpatrick. Now, Robert Jr. goes on to say that his mother was instrumental in helping her future husband to acquire his own quarry, and it does seem possible that she could have made him aware of local opportunities for work on the occasions that she returned home, or even facilitated an introduction to the local estate agents, on the estate, through whom he might have acquired the lease of a local quarry. Now, quarrying activity in the area around Thornhill had a long tradition, but more recently had taken off due to the demand created by houses such as Closeburn, which we've just seen, but also, of course, at Drumlandrig Castle, which you can see here, as well as a number of smaller commissions around this time, such as Closeburn Church, which you can also see here, which was built around 1741. And this activity alone would have attracted Paterson to the area, and indeed there is a tradition that Paterson worked on the construction of Closeburn Church and actually carved the date in the bell cut. And the stone for this commission had to come from quarries within 2 or 3 miles of these buildings. So it seems likely that Paterson would have acquired a lease on a local quarry, either directly for this commission, or more likely as a result of his experience in the area, and the realisation that there was more work to be had. As you can see from this advert, which dates from 1760, estates like Drumlandrig were by the mid-18th century touting for skilled labour and their families to populate local towns and villages in order to generate greater revenues and create local markets. And the building associated with this will of course have had a knock-on effect for Paterson's quarrying business, and similar activity would later help Elizabeth to earn a living from weaving. So with an eye to the future and the prospect of a wife in the area, Paterson acquired a quarry in Gatela Bridge, just over the Campbell Burn and therefore on Queensberry land, but the Buccleuch and Kirkpatrick's estates were very close. And based on parish records of when their first child was born, we can make a safe assumption that Paterson had certainly acquired the lease and started to develop his business by 1742, or at the latest by early 1743. And Paterson's quarry and his new home are long gone. They were subsumed by the industrial scale quarrying undertaken in the area by the quarrying firm of William Thompson and Sons in the late 19th century. And you can see here 2 of the company buildings and an old quarry. They fed stone to the burgeoning towns of Liverpool, Glasgow and Edinburgh, as well as cities on the east coast of Canada and the US. Paterson's quarry would nonetheless have been somewhere under Thompson's main quarry, which is now the council landfill site. And by 1748, the Reverend Peter Ray of Kirkconnell was reporting that there are several good freestone quarries in the parish, whereof Gatela Bridge is esteemed the best. Robert Jr. said that his father worked as a builder and hewer on the Duke of Queensberry's estate, and this is confirmed by the activity in the Drumlandrig accounts for the years in question, although it doesn't specifically name Paterson as a local supplier. He also says that Paterson found employment with Sir Thomas Kirkpatrick. When Closeburn House burnt down in August 1748, it wasn't rebuilt, and instead the Kirkpatrick family moved into the old Tower House and ordered sandstone slabs from Gatela Bridge Quarry for a new roof. Altogether, Robert Jr. commented, the demand which had been created allowed his father to employ a number of men, occasionally at least. Now, as to the family home, Robert Jr. remembered that his father built a substantial and comfortable house for himself and his family, with ground that kept 1 horse and 1 cow at moderate rent in Morton Parish. And that rent, according to estate records, was 5 shillings a year. And here, between 1744 and 1756, Robert and Elizabeth had at least 6 children, who were Margaret, John, Walter, Francis, Janet and Robert Jr. And it seems that Francis, named after Robert's brother of course, didn't survive infancy, and Janet may also have died early. But they would have attended Morton Old Church, of which you can see the ruins here, and the children would have attended the school next door. So by the 1750s, Paterson is well established in the community with a wife, home, family and business. But increasingly it seems, as his reputation grew, the demand he was asked to meet lay less and less in buildings and more in gravestones. And this is for a number of reasons. First, since the Reformation, people had to be buried outside the church in graveyards, which needed a marker of some sort. Second, as the economy grew and people acquired a little more money, more and more of the population were looking for permanent stone markers for their family. And as the 18th century developed, there was also an increasing fashion for intricately carved stones, complete with intimations of mortality, reminders of the deceased's coat of arms, tools of the trade, and so on. And third, there was the legacy of the Covenanters, and especially of the so-called killing times, with many local families now wanting to mark the falling places of their ancestors and martyrs. And you can see here the development of styles in gravestones, from simple slabs to low headstones to table stones, and to the full-blown intimations of mortality. And once again, Paterson slipped right into this tradition, accommodating whatever new style came along, but also, of course, as gravestones had to stand the test of time, carving or at least repairing older gravestones in the old-fashioned style as well. Now, Paterson's styles were later analysed by an historian and church minister called James King Hewison, who was from Thornhill, but also for a while he was a minister in Ayrshire and on the Isle of Bute. And he wrote extensively during his retirement on this subject in a series of articles in the Dumfries and Galloway Standard called Chisel Prints of Old Mortality. And here we can see an example of the style for which Paterson is perhaps best known. This is very much a 17th century style of Roman lettering, complete with ligatures in which letters are run together to save space and minimal decoration. And you can see this is the one on the left is from Girtham Parish near Gatehouse of Fleet. When I talk about ligatures, you can see that the word "this" in the middle right at the top, where the three letters are basically tied together to save space. It's worth pointing out, however, that this style was more or less uniform and can be found across Scotland, and this is important because I'll touch on this later. And the text nonetheless also contains references to the National League and Covenant, Christ's Crown and Covenant, and sometimes verses from the Book of Revelations. But also to the right is an example of a cursive style, which Paterson adopted for contemporary burials, in this case a member of the Harkness family who was a famous Covenanter and is buried just outside Thornhill. And here we can see other reportedly old mortality gravestones with contrasting styles, an old-fashioned table stone, again used for a Covenanter, and a contemporary and more decorative stone. This one's from Nithsdale. The important thing to note is that Paterson carved in different styles, not just one, according to the market he was addressing. And now we come to the crux of the story. In Joseph's Train version of the story, the stonemason is described from the outset as a dyed-in-the-wool Cameronian. That's to say, a follower of the tenets of Richard Cameron, the most extreme of the Covenanters, who had famously declared war on the state, nailing his proclamation to the market cross in Sanquhar in 1685. And it was for this reason, Train argued, that Paterson eventually left his home and his family in 1758 to devote himself exclusively, he said, to tending the graves of the Covenanters throughout the region. Robert Jr., on the other hand, tells his life story without mentioning his religious affiliations at all. Instead, he says that his father travelled into Galloway more and more to test the demand for his services and for gravestones in particular, given the relative absence of sandstone in the west of the region. That's to say that he travelled for commercial reasons. Finding the demand satisfactory, he says, Paterson eventually devoted himself completely to that side of his business. In his evidence, included in the introduction to the 1830 edition, Joseph Train cites the example of when the army of Bonnie Prince Charlie passed through the valley, through Nithsdale, and plundered the Paterson family home, as well as taking him prisoner for a while, because he is said to have condemned their leader for his Catholic faith. This is based on actual events, as stragglers from the Stuart army are recorded as causing trouble as they passed through Nithsdale between Christmas 1745 and the New Year. However, Robert Jr. says that, while the soldiers in question gave his mother quite a fright, as you can imagine, they merely asked his father to show them the nearest smithy, and then they let him go. So who are we to believe? Train has little or no evidence for his assertions, which seem only designed to perpetuate the story that Scott had already promoted. It's telling that while Train had been given Robert Jr.'s letter about his father in 1827, he never sent it to Scott, preferring instead to rewrite the story in his own hand with lots of embellishments. This contrasts with other letters and artifacts that he sent Scott all the time, without amendment. On the other hand, it does seem odd that Paterson would choose to leave his family and a thriving business by all accounts, simply to become an itinerant carver of gravestones among rural communities. In addition, his focus on the communities of Cucubershire and Galloway, notorious for their Covenanting support, as well as the preponderance of Covenanting stones for which he is known in the region, suggests that the traditional story has at least some basis, even if there was a certain amount of midlife crisis or just plain eccentricity that went with it. Coupled with this is the possibility that Robert Jr. and people like him by the 19th century had passed through the Enlightenment, the American War of Independence and the French Revolution and so on, and saw themselves as more rational than their forebears and were trying to shrug off the implied fanaticism of characters like Old Mortality. In my book, I've tried to find a middle course between these opposing sets of evidence. I doubt very much if Paterson cared about the Covenanting tradition when he first came to Nithsdale. Covenanting tradition had it that the Kirkpatricks had been part of the anti-Presbyterian establishment back in the 1680s, and Thomas Kirkpatrick was married to a Grierson, one of the most infamous and violent hunters of local Covenanters, and yet he worked for him. The Douglases of Drumlanrig had been similarly rigorous in their repression of the Covenanters, and yet Paterson took a quarry from them, worked for the estate, and paid them rent. It seems more likely that Paterson's commitment to the Covenanters, if that's what he developed, grew steadily over time, as a result both of his increasing association with people in the local area who were of that persuasion, and his travels into Galloway, initially for sound commercial reasons, where there were nonetheless many more like-minded people. As James King Hewison said, his stonecraft brought him to where rural hearts rang with the exploits of the hillmen. There were just half a dozen or so martyrs recorded in Nithsdale in 1714. But as more and more families sought to remember their forebears, this number increased. By the time the Martyrs' Cross on the right here, in Dalgarnock Cemetery near Thornhill, by the time that was erected in the 1920s, some 57 names had been recorded. Again, as James King Hewison said, eventually every parish in Nithsdale had a green mound or two, with or without a slab, to tell that a kindly Scot lies there for Christ's crown and covenant. Now Paterson would have cut or repaired several of these stones, got to know the families concerned, and in the process acquired from them the stories associated with their ancestors, and eventually he would have imbibed the whole tradition, such as the hiding places used by the Covenanters, as in Crick-up Lynn, pictured in the middle here, which was used by Scott as the basis for the concluding scene in Old Mortality. And he would have passed this on while on his travels to other families, receiving further commissions for work as a result. Regardless of his true motives, Paterson left his family and Nithsdale in about 1758, and thus began more than 40 years of travelling about the region in pursuit of his new calling. He did return 10 years later to uproot his family to Balmaclellan, but by all accounts still only used their new home there as an occasional base from which to continue his wanderings. Now, it's not possible to be precise about where he went, but we can pinpoint a number of locations and so establish a kind of pattern to his travels based on two sources of information: the evidence of the gravestones, which he is thought to have carved, and various documentary sources. Thanks to Hewison's investigations, it appears that Paterson visited the cemeteries and churchyards in at least the locations that are marked on this map, from Sanker in Upper Nithsdale down to Drumore in the Mull of Galloway. And one of the first Covenanter gravestones that Paterson is said to have installed and carved outside Nithsdale is this one on the left, which was originally in Glen Trull, David, to the north of Newton Stewart. Now, it was vandalised in the 1980s and repaired, but not before tests showed that the sandstone came from Gatler Bridge quarries, and is now in Newton Stewart Museum and has been replaced in situ by the one on the right. In addition to the sites in Nithsdale which we've seen, other Covenanter gravestones that Paterson either carved or repaired include these at Balmackie, on Loch Ken, Kirkmaiden south of Port Patrick, and St Cuthbert's Churchyard near Kirkcudbright. We already know from his life story generally that Paterson was in Thornhill and Balmaclellan, but other incidents place him consistently around Kirkcudbright and Gatehouse, the bottom middle of the map there. Robert Jr., for example, says that his older brother Walter was sent to find his father in about 1760, when he was about 12 years old, and located him in Kirkchrist Churchyard to the west of Kirkcudbright. Paterson is then said to have taken on his son as an apprentice, which fits with what we know of Walter's later career. In 1766, according to the records of a court case in Kirkcudbright, a stonecutter called Robert Paterson was ordered to pay a debt of 5 shillings for the hire of a pony, which he used to transport goods out to Glenluce and Wigtown. This is not the only instance we'll find of Paterson owing money. In addition, when he finds his eldest son John a position on a farm in the early 1770s, it's supposed to be due to contacts that he had on the Inch near Stranraer, over in the west there. And found among his possessions after his death was a note recording his debt to a landlady called Margaret Crystal for accommodation near Gatehouse of Fleet. Now, this note was reproduced by Train in his letter of March 1829 to Scott. The original is long gone, but it's interesting for a number of reasons. First, the tiny prices that people paid for food and lodging at the time. Second, to note that Paterson still owed money for them. You see unpaid there, 5 shillings and 5 pence. Third, to see Paterson catching up with a fellow traveller and old friend over a couple of drinks. I'll just explain that. You can see 3 chaplains of Yell with Sandy the Keelman. Now, Sandy the Keelman was a commercial salesman trading in crushed lime, which was used to mark sheep. But he was also from Pen Pont, which is where Paterson was originally from. And so this is an instance of 2 old men catching up with each other towards the end of their careers over 3 chaplains of Yell, which is 3 pints of beer. Now, fourth, it's interesting fourthly, because we can also trace Margaret Crystal, which is not a common name, back to Dundrennan, where her father, John Crystal, worked on the Netherlaw estate down by the coast. And on that estate was a sandstone quarry, one of the very few along this coast. In the Middle Ages, it supplied stone to Dundrennan Abbey, but was still being used in the 18th century and was most probably visited by Paterson on several occasions as part of his work. We don't know this for sure, but it's very interesting to guess at the connections that Paterson was making on his travels and to join up these dots in his life. Now, based on this evidence, we can see that Paterson covered much of what is now Dumfries and Galloway, and it's possible, according to Joseph Traynor and Robert Jr., that his work extended into Ayrshire and up towards the Clyde Estuary and Clyde Valley as well, although James King Hewison's detective work didn't extend that far. However, another tradition, based on Scott's claim of meeting old mortality, which I described earlier, asserts that Paterson travelled as far afield as Dunnottar in Aberdeenshire on the northeast coast. And there, a memorial in the local churchyard commemorates 9 Covenanters who died while being held in the dungeons below Dunnottar Castle in May 1685. And it's this stone that Sir Walter Scott was visiting when he's supposed to have met Paterson on the occasion described in the novel. Now, the stone in question certainly appears to be a good example of Paterson's style. This is the picture of the stone in situ in the local churchyard. And this is a copy of the inscription, the one on the left, with Paterson's Colden's headstone next to it for comparison. You can see it's got incised Roman lettering, employs ligatures extensively, and concludes with references to the Book of Revelations, etc. But as I said before, this style of lettering was quite traditional and uniform across Scotland, so the inscription doesn't guarantee Paterson's involvement. We also know from Scott's letters that while he was here on holiday with a friend in 1793 before he was famous, there's no mention in those letters of his meeting Paterson at the time, and Scott didn't keep a diary until later in his life. However, in a letter to an English minister in 1827, Scott repeated the assertion that he had met old mortality, but he makes it clear in the letter that he knew little or nothing about the man himself, and he refers to him as John Paterson. And finally, in the introduction to the 1830 edition, Scott came clean and admitted that the meeting that he described previously was actually a very brief one, and that the picture painted in chapter 1 of the original novel is pure embellishment. If true, however, the story of the meeting, however briefly, would suggest that Paterson made a round trip of at least 400 miles on foot to visit the site at the age of 77. So again, you pays your money and you takes your choice. What all of this does tell us, however, is that Paterson's itinerant lifestyle, again, fitted into a pattern of activity that was increasingly prevalent in the second half of the 18th century, helped by an improvement in local roads and more bridges being built. This period was noted for its travellers of all kinds and descriptions, from religious zealots and visionaries to storytellers who would bring news of the outside world to remote communities, to salesmen who were touting for more and more sophisticated goods from an increasingly industrialised society and the ports that served them. Between 1758 and 1768, while Elizabeth was still in Thornhill, she notionally had 5 children to bring up, although she very quickly farmed out her eldest, John, to a cousin near Glen Capel, and as we see in the next boy, Walter, became apprenticed to his father and presumably travelled with him for a while. So she and the girls, assuming Janet survived infancy, would then very likely have sustained themselves on a combination of subsistence farming. The few remittances which Paterson may have sent his wife, Robert Jr. says his father did make few remittances, and crucially the weaving of woolen garments for the local market. And the same adverts that we saw earlier encouraging skilled labour to the area also offered generous premiums for good quality blankets, cloths and stockings, and that was a traditional way in which households kept themselves together. But later, when she and her family went to Balmaclellan, Elizabeth is said to have set up an adventure school. This is the church in Balmaclellan, which they would have attended. When they were in Balmaclellan, Elizabeth is said to have set up an adventure school, which is basically a private and unlicensed school for which she would have charged daily fees for a basic education. And tradition and some documentary evidence suggests that the Patersons' cottage and therefore the adventure school was in fact here, or at least on this site, which is now a garage or an engineering shed of some sort in the centre of the village. It wasn't until 1785, ironically the same year that Elizabeth died, that her son Walter was commissioned to build the first dedicated school building in the parish. Robert Jr. became a shoemaker and married a local girl. One of his sons, Thomas, paid for this family gravestone to be erected in the local churchyard in 1855. And in fact, it's from Balmaclellan that we get one of the few contemporary eyewitness accounts of Robert Paterson. In 1876, a by then elderly inhabitant of the village, Mrs. Janet Clement McClellan, remembered seeing him on one occasion when she was just a young bit lassie, and Paterson himself around 80 years old. She said, "He was a gay, droll-looking old body. He was riding on a wee bit white pony, had on an old hat hanging over his lugs, and the pony was ganging unco slow." Now, by the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution was already well underway in Scotland, and the series of social and economic changes that implied in both the countryside and the burgeoning new towns meant that the population of like minds with whom Paterson could spend time was rapidly diminishing, reducing his choice of rural homes with sympathetic families in which to stay, and possibly accounting for his need to stay in commercial lodgings by the end of his life. It was also in this context that Paterson was to be found at the age of 84, still looking to buy headstones from quarries near Dumfries during the winter of 1800-1801. According to his son Robert Jr., he'd first gone to Lockerbriggs quarry. Quote, "After stopping there 5 or 6 days," he said, and all that time complaining of a pain in his bowels, he set out for Bank End in the parish of Kylaverock. And this is because there was a small, as I said earlier on, there's a small freestone quarry, sandstone quarry there, near the port of Glen Capel, from where the headstones he acquired could be carried by boat along the Solway coast. And the local quarrymen, Robert Jr. continued, saw Paterson coming towards them on his pony, noticed that something was odd, and then watched in alarm as he fell off. They ran to him, lifted him up and carried him into the quarrymaster's house, where he was able to tell them who he was and where his sons lived before he died. In a poignant last line which sums up how little his family knew of him, Robert Jr. concludes, "He was born in 1712, died on the 29th of January 1801. Now Joseph Train sent none of this detail to Scott, but he did confirm that the news of their father's death was conveyed to his family in Balmaclellan. However, due to bad weather, it seems that his sons were not able to reach Bank End in time, and that Paterson was actually given a pauper's funeral, possibly 2 weeks after he died. A note of the funeral expenses was among the possessions that Robert Jr. was given once he did reach the site, presumably with a request to pay the balance owing. His father, true to form, had left the debt. The original note was given to Train, and he transcribed it for his letter to Scott in 1829, but once again the original is missing. The version you see here was copied by Robert Hastings, the stonecutter who engraved the Paterson family headstone in Balmaclellan in 1855. And he passed it on to Dr. Thomas Boyle Grierson of Thornhill, a local antiquarian, whose handwriting this is. And this is the full version. And you'll see that the local parish took the opportunity of Paterson's funeral to have a little reception, including something to drink. And this wasn't unusual at the time, as we have to remember that Paterson would have been known to people in the area if he had frequented the local quarry often enough. But there's a crucial difference between Train's and Robert Jr.'s version of these events, as a result of which the exciseman Joseph Train seems to have done mortality a final disservice. Train hid from Scott the fact that Paterson had ended his days in Bank End, instead saying that he simply died after visiting one churchyard too many, the last one being, Train said, at Bank Hill of Lockerbie, some 20 miles away. And this wasn't a mistake. Train refers to Bank Hill 4 times in his version of the story, including a doctoring of the funeral expenses seen here, when he transcribed them, even though that document included a signed statement from Robert Jr. and other witnesses to the effect that it was all true. Why did he do this? We've already seen that having told his client and idol, Scott, one version of the story, Train preferred to invent and embellish rather than admit he had got things wrong. The fact that All Mortality had died near Bank Hill of Lockerbie is one of the few facts also contained in the original 1816 novel, facts which Scott presumably got from Train. 14 years later, Train was loath to admit that he'd got even this small thing wrong. Why does this matter? Because Train then tells Scott that Robert Jr. was prevented by indisposition from even going to Bank Hill to attend the funeral of his father, which I regret very much, as he is not aware in what churchyard he was interred. Now this flies in the face of even Train's version of events, but Train's facts, once published in the new edition of Scott's novel, became the definitive public version, and meant that, ironically, for a man who spent his life marking where others were buried, Paterson's own burial spot, despite his popularity, could not be determined for a long time afterwards. Writing to Train, Scott lamented this fact and added, "I would certainly erect a monument to his memory at my own expense." True to his word, he left money in his will to cover the expense of erecting a memorial and instructions to his publishers to attempt to locate Paterson's gravesite in order to do so. And this they did, but not until 1869, when Black & Sons paid for this memorial to be erected in Bank End of Kylaverock churchyard, and actually there's no guarantee that this is the site of his grave, it's simply a memorial in the graveyard. Now, until recently, I'd assumed that this was the only original artefact of Robert Paterson, which is still available to see. And this is his leather pocketbook, which you can find on display in Dumfries Museum. The penciled note inside, shown on the right there, is hard to read, but it suggests that the pocketbook was not among the possessions given to Train by Robert Jr., and it seems more likely it was given to the museum towards the end of the 19th century, possibly by Paterson's great-granddaughter-in-law. However, after I published the book, I was contacted by a descendant of Joseph Train's, a man who now lives in London but whose family come from Ayrshire. And he said that he still had a number of Train's letters and artefacts, including All Mortality's mel, or wooden mallet, which he carried with him and used to drive the chisel into the stone. And the mel, which you can see here, was until recently on exhibition at Abbotsford, and I think you'll agree it's a substantial lump of oak. Now, we've already seen how popular Scott's novels were. We already know how popular Scott's novels are, both during his lifetime and after his death. And this applied equally to, or indeed sometimes because of, the characters he created, such as All Mortality. But what I've tried to do in my book, as I said earlier, is to tease apart the version of the story that Scott created with Train's contributions and the reality as so far as we can gauge it. Scott's depiction of the old stonecutter was similar to the truth in terms of the clothes he wore, his famous grumpiness. Mrs. McClellan, from whom we heard earlier, went on to say that Robert Jr. was bad-tempered but very honest and truthful, adding that the whole family had dour tempers. And he also depicted him as a throwback to a simpler age, in which principles and values meant more than money and the luxuries it could buy. But Scott painted all of the Covenanters in his book in the same way, and in fact he got into trouble after the original publication from people in the southwest of the country for what they claimed was stereotyping of Covenanters. So there was little that was unique here. By contrast, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Paterson acted at least as much from commercial and practical motives in the second half of his career as he did from the religious fanaticism with which Train tries to depict him. In fact, it may have been the first set of motives that brought him into contact with people and traditions whose influence eventually led him to adopt the more eccentric style of life for which he became famous. But even within that lifestyle, the evidence I've managed to unearth suggests, on the one hand, that the geographical area in which he travelled was more restricted than tradition would have it, and also, on the other, that there was a pattern and a purpose to his wanderings, with clear routes between the places in which he stayed, and a fit with local traditions of stonemasonry and commercial salesmen. So whatever we may think of Paterson temporarily abandoning his family, there was a logic and a pattern to his career, and to his life, dictated as much by the materials of his chosen trade as by the fashions of the period, and the conditions of the region in which he lived. And so Paterson, in that sense, fitted into his life and times. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and that was an amazingly wide-ranging and well-researched talk. I mean, just to make the point about well-researched, I fished out the Edinburgh edition of Old Mortality before I came here this evening, and all it does is reproduce the Magnum, unless I missed something, reproduce the Magnum note, which we know now came from Train, who was telling Scott what he wanted to hear, it would seem, to a large extent. So this is very new and interesting material. We're caught between two stools now. The canopies are going to be outside by 20 past, but at least as it doesn't matter, we've got 10 to 15 minutes for questions if people want to ask anything. Sorry, gentleman, Eric at the back. Yeah.
Sir, you're going to get the award of the Balmaclellan postcard.
Thank you.
In advance of your talk, last week, my brother took me to Balmaclellan and fully vouched for that very same photograph. So I recommend to people to go and take the trail to Dumfries, Castle Douglas and here. But anyway, my wee question was, and I know very well the landscape between Lockerbie and Lochmaven and Eskdalemuir. And I've read Old Mortality in the last 3 weeks in anticipation of your coming. So I think it's brilliant that you've done a forensic deconstruction. Anyway, process of association, can you tell me if the famous Thomas Telford went to the same quarry in the Lockerbie Lochmaven area to which the Robert Paterson went? Because it's the same vein of old red sandstone that we well know about. There's another antiquarian that's been in there, the name of that anyway. But in Dumfries White Sands, there's also a memorial to Covenanters by noticing granite in the White Sands.
The one on the White Sands is to Robert Kirkhope, Covenanter, yeah.
Yes, but anyway, do you know anything about Telford and his apprenticeship? Because I think these men, these stonemasons, they made modern Scotland in a way.
They did, yeah.
I think Telford got his apprenticeship in the same vein. I just wondered.
I don't know so much about Robert Telford. I know Eskdalemuir in that area, and I've been up to the very remote farm, which is still farmed, where Telford was born, and that's again worth going to if you are in that area. I don't know which quarries he used, but if he was doing work at all in Dumfries and Galloway, he would have been using the same quarries. There's only so many deposits of sandstone and so many quarries that were excavated as a result of that. Some of them are still very much in operation. Lockerbriggs, for example, outside Dumfries, is the main source of sandstone for the whole region. Corncockle is still occasionally used. I myself work on a project in Dumfries where we've used stone to restore a house from Corncockle Quarry. And there will be others. The Drumlandrig, for example, still uses the Royal Quarry near Thornhill as well for when it needs to repair Drumlandrig. So they will be the same quarries, no doubt.
My further point would be that I read the 1908 edition of Walter Scott's Old Mortality, and I'm just amazed that Walter Scott, and maybe you would say something too, Walter Scott has let truth not get in the way of a jolly good story. Because Walter Scott was more purpose to show what dissension there was lingering still at all within Scotland and South West at that time. And so did S.R. Crockett as well, although S.R. Crockett didn't like the way Walter Scott's take on many, many things. But have you got an idea, my question is, have you got an idea for a book, historical book to follow on?
Me?
Yes.
Right, that came from left field. Yes, and now that I've got the bug, as it were, I'm working on an aspect of family history to do with a couple of uncles who were in the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and the kilt which they wore, which I've inherited, or one of them wore, which I've inherited. So I want to do a story on that. Okay, thank you.
David.
Is it likely that Paterson was paid for some of the restoration by the families?
Restoration
of the stones, of the gravestones?
It's possible that he was paid something, but it's very much more likely, given his straitened circumstances, which are very obvious through his life, that he was simply paid in kind. He would have stayed with them. He would have been paid in food and lodging, and simply moved on. What comes across very forcibly is the man existed on next to nothing, constantly leaving debts left, right, and centre. And that fits with what Robert Jr. and Joseph Train, to be fair to him, said as well. That the man, there was a clear streak of eccentricity. Even Scott says this later on, because Scott, it's going into a different story, but Scott actually dined at Abbotsford with Robert Paterson's great-grandson, and who was a minister, and teased out of him some stories about his great-grandfather, but not enough to fill the gaps later on. And I forgot what I was going to say, why I said that, but that's some background anyway.
You said they sent back some remittances to his family.
Yeah. According to Robert Jr.'s.
Yes, it wasn't sort of identified how many and how much, and whether it was very little.
Sorry, going back to this gentleman's question. At that time, and this is what I tried to tease out in the book as well, the development from the beginning of the 18th century to the end. At the beginning of the 19th century, it's very much a subsistence economy. People basically bartering. Paterson's father in Hawick was a landowner, which meant he's supposed to have paid a certain amount per year to the church for its upkeep, and instead he gave them 5 bags of coal, that kind of thing. By the end of the century, people are more and more expecting to be paid in money, in hard cash, and there's a clear commercial drive through the century. More and more farmers turning from subsistence farming to being forced to pay proper rents to their landowners, and some of them being turfed out, and then the lowland clearances are starting to happen, and so on. So what I've tried to do in the story, as well as telling Robert Paterson's story, is to show the economic and social background.
I mean, his life story, the evidence for it is obviously extremely patchy. But what did strike me is that he seemed to have run quite a successful business at one stage.
Yeah.
Any idea of what happened?
This is the central conundrum. I said at the crux of the story, because Train very clearly says he just decided he was going to go off and tend to the graves of the Covenanters. Yeah. His son is saying no, he had a successful commercial business. He decided to, because there was an expanding business in Gravestone, which is undoubted there was that. He decided to try his hand further afield to make some money that way.
I mean, it doesn't make any sort of commercial sense for a man who's married with several children, because he was obviously employing several people. If you then go off and just do your own little labour, that will never, of course.
As you say,
it may just have been eccentricity, or he fell out with his wife, or whatever.
Yeah, this is the central conundrum to the whole story. Yeah, and all I can say is that if you put together this story, this idea of people not necessarily relying on hard cash, not necessarily being that commercially driven, even though Robert Jr. says he employs some men occasionally at least, there is a certain amount of subsistence still going on, and he may have decided that he found the business was drying up for whatever reason. He'd try his hand at these gravestones, going around, travelling around with a couple of headstones on the side of a pony, and that made him enough money. But eventually something happened to drive him to doing that on a full-time basis, and clearly not making any money out of it. Yeah.
Is there any evidence that he restored graves other than Covenanting graves?
Oh yes, yeah. As I tried to show there. Yeah. I mean, the graves that we know about that are his, not all of them are necessarily Covenanting gravestones, especially in Nithsdale before 1758. There are all different styles.
Yeah, and the other thing is the Denoter story. You kept your options open, but really, Scott was 1796. He was in pursuit of William. He'd gone to Aberdeen and he visited the castle at Denoter, saw the memorial stone. Later in his life, he wrote a novel, possibly having heard about it independently or through Train, about Robert Paterson. Surely the most likely thing is that he connected two separate things.
You might say so. I couldn't possibly comment. I agree with you. It's possible that he, dredging back his memory, thought, I remember I went to that gravestone and there was somebody sculpting one of these there, and the way your mind works, you think, that was all mortality.
Yeah. I think the canopies are calling. There are a couple of things to do first before we finally thank our speaker for the last time. And of course, you'll stay behind and be able to talk to people for a while afterwards.
Thank you. Yes.
Because I'm sure there are more things that people want to ask. Our next meeting on Thursday the 15th of June is when Professor Jeremy Smith of Glasgow University will talk on Sir Walter Scott in Dictionaries, Invention and Artistry. It's customary to present our speakers with this book of past presidential addresses, so there's one of the rare unsigned copies, but we'll sign it for you if you like. And talking about which, Iain has brought a few copies of his paperback here, which is available at the charge, slight charge, and he himself will be glad to sign them if people are interested in getting a copy. And unless I've forgotten something, Lee, it's been a long stretch this. Unless I've forgotten something, I'd call on Ronnie, who's kindly agreed to give the vote of thanks.
Again, can I thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I come from Glasgow, that's the other place around here, and I make this journey once a month or so to hear these lectures, which are of superb standard, and yours is no exception. Thank you very much indeed. Old Mortality, of course, is a novel which we all know. I know it every Thursday. I drive over the bridge at Bodwell. There's a huge memorial to the Covenanters, and it reminds me every Thursday when I go to pick up my grandson about the novel All Right. And just only last week I read a very fine article by Professor Ali Lumsden in a comparison between Old Mortality and Ring Gilhay by Iain, by Galt. It's a superb article. But although we know a lot about Old Mortality, until tonight we didn't know very much about the man Old Mortality, so thank you very, very much for that. It was a very lucid and helpful lecture that we had from you. I want to thank you for going so much further than Scott's introduction to the Magnum edition, and also so much further than Crockett's Scott originals. I mean, you've taken us much further down the road than that. I want to also thank you for, we all do, for the superb illustrations that you presented us with. And I think most of all for directing us to Robert, the young Paterson's account of his father's life, where the Old Mortality worked with in the quarries, both with his brother and later, of course, in Nithsdale. And finally, telling us how he became interested in the Covenanting and helping us to understand that very complex final part of his life. Can't thank you enough for that. And thank you for just the lucidity and the scholarship, as Peter said. It was massive. Thank you. I intend to buy a book right now. And I hope some of my friends here will do so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.